We'll have people streaming in, but we wanted to go ahead and get started. And so my name is Eniko Atherton. I'm the Executive Director of Social Venture Partners Seattle, and I just wanted to welcome you here to kick off SVP Seattle's official advocacy program. And share a little bit about that journey and who we are, but really the night is about Anne. And so just so you all know, if you're not familiar with SVP, we are a cross-race, cross-class collective of people working to advance racial justice and equity through philanthropy. But we define our philanthropy as sharing financial wealth, but also our time, our talent, our networks, and using our voice as well, and which is how we landed in this advocacy space. 2 years ago, the board adopted advocacy as a core part of our programming. And that was really that as we feel like it's so important to support direct organizations, we also know that there are larger systematic inequities going on that aren't going to change without policy change, big policy change, and that we collectively have a really strong voice. We have a lot of connections, and this was an important role for us to play. We also heard from our community partners that it was important for us, SVP, to show up in all areas, if we really believed in racial equity, to show up across issue areas, whether it's education or criminal justice, the environment, or public health, to show up and be as willing to advocate as we are and speak up to elected officials and other decision makers as we are to write a check. And then to uniquely find our niche, talking about something that's really, I think, central to us, which is the idea of wealth. I think when you think of philanthropy, I think, who do I think of today? It used to be Rockefeller, now it might be Mackenzie Scott, but it's not always the people that we think, which is everybody in this room, anyone that really wants to share a personally meaningful gift, and so that is who we are, sharing our voice. And I want to give a big thank you to the group that put this together. This was actually not a staff-led effort, but a team from our board, who we love, Melissa Johnson, Terry Cole, Renee Russick. I know I'm not seeing, and Tali Roush, who worked for over 2 years to make this happen, along with support from the SVP board. There's a lot more. We'll kind of wrap up and share what's going on next at this. And then just three logistical notes. We have food in the back. Feel free to grab food and drinks. We inconveniently placed, this is on our end, the compost and trash and recycling is there on your way out. The restrooms are out and to your right and to your right. And so those are the logistical notes. And before we get started, I also, we are in a really special place if you haven't been here before. And I want to invite Tremaine to come up and just share a few words about Bird Bar.
I just hope people be careful of applause. I'm the only child. You took a couple of my notes as Director of Operations. I was going to give the logistics of what she said. Thank you all so much for being here. I've been joking with them. This is part of what I'm calling our soft launch, our soft opening to using this space in this way. As stated, I'm Tremaine Edwards. I'm the new Director of Operations. I've been about 6 weeks now. Joining here this organization, I oversee just about everything in this space, including our programs here at Bird Bar, which includes our energy assistance programs, that includes our food bank. That's, I think, some of you, when you got here before, we closed it, get to walk around and check it out. We have a community connector program that essentially, if we don't offer the services here, we have a dedicated person to assist you in a handoff to the next program. We also help with financial literacy courses, as well as really just connecting in any way that we can in the community. But I know that this was something that was really important to a lot of us that are new on the team. We have a whole new leadership team. I got here 5 days before our CEO, so I like to joke I have seniority over her for 5 days. But it was really important for us to how we look at using this space in this community as well. But a little bit of the history of Bird Bar Place. It's been around almost 60 years. As you walk before you leave, you check out that hallway near the restrooms, there's also kind of a timeline of our history. There's timelines and history everywhere around the building, so I encourage you to check it out. It started about 60 years ago, named named Camp, and then it became Cinderstone, and a few years ago it was changed to Bird Bar Place, named after Roberta Bird Bar. Again, all of that history is there, so you can read it to give time back to you all, to your space. But we're really happy that you're here. Check us out, learn more about us, be a part of us. We always love volunteers, we love people in the space. And if you have any other, as I like to say, comments, questions, concerns, compliments, or complaints, because I'm an English major who loves information, I am around the corner, although I'll be in the board meeting at 6 o'clock. But I'm around, you can yell, I can hear you from upstairs. Thank you all so much for being here and using our space today.
Just one other logistical note. We're going to do a Q&A, and so we'll hear Anne speak. You can write your questions on these index cards while volunteers coming and passing them out, and then Anne and I will have a discussion with your questions at the end. And with that, I'm going to introduce SVP Seattle's Board Chair, Ruby Love.
Hi everyone, I am absolutely jazzed that you are all here. Thank you so much for seeing this as an important subject. And an important subject not only for SVP, but for our community as a whole. I also want to tell you that this place was my very first client when I came to Seattle from Chicago. It was Camp, and Larry Gossett was the director at that time. This place has an incredible history. It was a fire station, and my husband used to serve here also. So it's kind of weird. Anyway. I'm here to introduce my friend, Anne Price. We had a lovely time with her last night at dinner. Sorry you all couldn't be there. But it was invite only, and this is inviting everybody who wants to come. I'm really happy that she said yes to our invitation to speak. There was not required reading before you came, but in the event that you looked her up, hopefully you saw that she co-authored with 6 other colleagues What We Get Wrong About Closing the Racial Wealth Gap. And it's an article that, to be honest with you, it rattled the academic and the philanthropic world. Because they said that we have taken a deeply structural problem that is hundreds of years in the making and overlaid it with very small individual solutions based on flawed and often false narratives. SVP is honored to have her with us because she's going to not only present, but we'll have open dialogue and discussion. And I think that's most important for us on this topic because none of us know all that should and could be known about this topic. She's the co-founder of the Maven Collaborative, which centers race, gender, and joy in the pursuit of economic justice, from grassroots building to grass tops debate. She and her colleagues push the progressive movements to properly diagnose economic problems, build new policies, and promote new politics to address the root causes of economic exclusion. She's a connector, an educator, a writer, and a researcher. She will keep you thinking, she's going to cause you to laugh, and she's going to cause you to question your long-held beliefs. Please give her a very warm welcome.
Leave it to Ruby to give you an opening you have to really live up to. It's scary. Can I do all these things? I don't know. It's so great to be with you here this evening. Oh, I met one of my colleagues that I work with from the Assets Funders Network. To talk about this topic, which when I started this work, I just found so fascinating, and I still continue to find it so fascinating and learning so much about it. It's a topic we just haven't been taught in school. We don't talk a lot about this issue, only kind of in a very superficial way. And so I'm glad we're able to dig in tonight. So I want to make this, I don't want to stand up here and act like a professor. No, I'm not a professor, but I don't want this just to be me going through some slides, even though I do have a lot of slides. But I want us to have some time to to kind of open up with an exercise and to make this as interactive as possible, to field any questions or thoughts that you may have as we go through this. So just a little bit of a note. I'm only going to scratch the surface of this topic because we don't have that much time together. But the real purpose is to kind of give us this foundational understanding and to kind of really be provocative and push our thinking to go further with the topic. So with all that said, let me get started. So I'm going to start with this slide, uncomfortable truths. You know, one thing about talking about race and wealth in this country is there are uncomfortable truths because it's so tied to our history. And so I always make this invitation to live with a little bit of discomfort. It's okay. That's what challenges us and pushes us. And so today we're gonna touch upon some of those uncomfortable truths, but I don't want us to shy away from them. I want us to kind of lean into them as much as we can. And say, you know, we don't have all the answers all the time, but we have more answers than we think on this topic. Okay, so I always think about this work as like really thinking about what's behind a curtain. And so, you know, a lot about how race is accumulated in this country has been hidden from us. It's been hidden from us. And so I would say that a lot of times we don't have an understanding about how wealth is actually accumulated and why it differs across so many racial and ethnic groups. So we're gonna pull back this curtain on wealth. It's both about accumulation and extraction, and we're gonna dig into a little bit of both of those things. So I'm gonna start with my own story a little bit. I was born in Ohio, really a Midwesterner, raised in Wisconsin. And I can trace, you know, some sides of my family to Barbados and having my great-great-great-grandparents come and make their way in the US. They were all professionals. This is like great-great-great-grandfather. 2 of them were Episcopal priests, and 3 of them were doctors. My grandmother, and this is her sitting on her grandfather's lap, went to college at 16. She went to Indiana State. She left there, started to teach at the age of 20, and then went to Columbia. When you see these pictures, this is a picture of a very middle-class Black family. You know, people who were educated that were born in the 1800s. This is them going on vacation, right? And the story about my family that's so fascinating is while they had a great deal of education, were high achievers. One of my cousins was one of the inventors of stainless steel. It still didn't result in wealth for any of them. Highly educated, accomplished, but it did not result in wealth. And there are a lot of reasons why that didn't occur, and we're going to talk about some of those today. But I think about my wealth story as one in which all the hard work and education didn't result in wealth. Resulted in great other things, but not financial wealth. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm really fascinated by the fact that what's been hidden from us a lot of times are Black middle-class families in its history. To even have photographs at this time was pretty amazing. So I'm very proud of that history, and to really talk about the legacy of wealth and why across 4 generations wealth couldn't be built in my family. So we're going to start with a little question, a couple of questions. And I want us to answer these questions ourselves. There are 2 check-in questions. One is, what does wealth look like to you? And how did your wealth journey begin? So this is just something you can know or just think silently to yourself. You know, to model this question, I think what wealth looks like to me is peace of mind. It looks like breathing room. It feels like I can weather a catastrophe. Feels easy, it means I have choices. So think about what wealth is like to you, even in your own bodies, right? How it feels, what it means to you. And then think a little bit about your wealth journey. Take one side of your family, take a great-grandmother, take a grandmother. How did your family get here? Where did they come from? What were they able to do once they got here? How were resources passed down from one generation to another? Who was able to get some of those resources or not? So I'm just gonna this is just like our zenning into the moment. Just take a few minutes to think about these two questions. I challenge you. And then at the end of that, we're gonna just do a popcorn for anyone that wants to share the answers to these questions. Now, I will say on the wealth journey, we can't have a 20-minute iteration of your wealth story. But there's just some key things, like I shared with you. Just made me think my family story is education did not result in wealth accumulation. So just think a little bit about your own story. And I'll talk to you about why we're doing this in just a few minutes when we finish this exercise. So it's 5:38, and at 5:43, I'll come back to you all. Sit with it for a minute. That's like a bit of an uncomfortable silence for me. I don't know what it is, but it's like 3 minutes. I saw some folks writing some notes and thinking about it, but if you feel ready to share either both or one of these questions, I'd love to hear from you. What's on your mind? Who wants to start? All right, is that Renee back there?
Yeah.
Go for it, Renee.
So my grandparents were immigrants.
Well, let me give you my mic. It might just be easier, I guess, sometimes. It's okay, everyone says that, but.
All right, so were immigrants, Jews leaving, Russian, Polish, places that weren't friendly. On my dad's side, they were tradespeople. My grandfather was a bookbinder. And on my mom's side, they were more educated. They were able to benefit from gaining access to education. Then my dad was going to World War II, was able to benefit from the GI Bill, which paid for college. My parents were able to then, my mom was educated through college and beyond. They both received advanced degrees, and they were able to get a mortgage and get a house, and that's how they built middle-class wealth. Kind of a classic, certain kind of classic story in this country. So that's it.
Thank you, Renee. Trying to steal a bit of my presentation there with policies in place and with the whole piece. That was great. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else have anything they want to share?
I'll share.
Go ahead.
Okay. My grandfather immigrated to Victoria, BC as a laborer, and I'm the 22nd out of 32 grandchildren. He had 11 kids. What was amazing about him is he had 11 pieces of property in Victoria, British Columbia. His wealth did not, his property wealth went to the boys, so, my uncles. My father immigrated from Canton. Interestingly enough, he went to University of Washington, and he was in this military service over on the Burma Road and over in China. And I think what both my mother, who never had an opportunity to go to school, but my father-in-law, they encouraged both my husband's siblings and us to go to school. And so in my immediate family, 2 or 3 of us got to finish University of Washington, and then we were able to be in the right place at the right time for jobs that we could afford, our own places, and what you see that's happening is that my kids are being raised by educators. And so I still have my 1972 orange rugs in my house because we paid everything in tuitions for our kids to go to school. So that was the really wealth that was pushed down by my mom and my uncles and aunts, and we were able to go to school, which secured our kids a place. I have 2 boys, and they're in the IT industry. So we're kind of short-term as a family in the United States, but we're there.
It's fantastic. Thank you, Donna. Is there one more person we can keep moving? Do you want to share anything? Oh, here's someone back here. You pass that to Georgia.
I think I was struck reflecting on your story, how my story was sort of the opposite, that despite lack of education, people were still able to accumulate wealth in my family. And I think about my grandfather who immigrated to Canada from Europe, also a Jewish immigrant. And he never went to college. Both my parents were the first generation in their families to go to college. And yet despite that, there weren't restrictions on them on my grandfather buying real estate, and he ended up, I think, similar to your story, buying a lot of real estate around Montreal. And along with that, I'm sure there must have been access to credit that allowed him to do that. And so, yeah, it just was striking to me that because of the color of his skin, despite not having any education, the wealth was still possible there.
Thank you for sharing those stories. And one reason I wanted to just start this way is to get us in the mindset to think about how wealth looks so different across all of us. We all have an individual story. Where our parents or grandparents, where they immigrated from, how they landed, where they landed, really speaks to the fact that we all have a journey and that we all are connected in some ways. And I want to talk a little bit about that in a minute. But getting ourselves in the mindset to understand our own story so we can see it nestled in the structures and systems that are in place are so important to really see why, how our country was really shaped. So I just appreciate you being willing to share your story. You're all great. And for us to kind of lean in this way to this work. Okay, so I started by talking about wealth, just my own little mini definition. And I know this is long, it's a lot of words. But really this just idea about living a life of peace, having choices, being resilient, vibrant. It gives us, wealth gives us this ability to provide for future generations. It lets us be, it means we can be healthy and know that our family networks and communities are spiritually whole and contributing to. So this is a definition that we put together at Maven, really listening to a range of people and how they define wealth. It's not just financial, it's really what wealth allows us to do. And that's why it's so important. And so what if we really thought about wealth beyond the financial? And I think there's a lot that we can support, that we can actually even invest in. That's not just about getting an asset, but about allowing communities to actually be whole, to be thriving, for people to kind of live out their dreams. So that's how we talk about wealth at Maven. So let's get into some of the facts around this. And so when we look about what is this racial wealth gap that people talk about so much, and so when we look at the differences in wealth by race, we see that a typical household, a white household has more than $160,000 more than typical Black and Latinx household. And so, this is a lot of money. So when people say, oh my God, we're going to close the wealth gap by having this program, I think, you're able to do this, because this is 400 years in the making. And that's what it really looks like at a very individual household level, that we see these kinds of differences. So that's just one way to look at the wealth gap. The other is just to take a wider view, right? The richest 400 richest billionaires have more wealth than all 10 million black people combined. And we know that there is extreme wealth in this country. Even if you took away the top 10% of wealth holders, we'd still have, this number would still be 80%. There'd be an 80% gap. So it's not just people at the tippy top. That we have very extreme inequality. And it really, really comes through when we look at this in the aggregate. So, you know, we just had people share their stories. Some folks, relatives came into Canada, through Canada. And one thing that we learned about wealth is that it looks different everywhere. There's just nowhere you can look at two places and see the same thing. And this is just giving some indication of what wealth looks like for certain types of households in Miami and Los Angeles. So I'm going to say a little bit about this. We don't have good wealth data. We really don't have good wealth data at all. And why we don't have good wealth data is because very few people get access to tax records. I was talking to a friend at the Federal Reserve, and they're like, even we have to fight the IRS and the tax records. We don't have that data. And so it's very hard to be able to even get these numbers. For us, I did a special study with economist friends that were at Duke and UCLA and the New School who did a study to try to disaggregate populations in different places to get a sense of wealth. So this is only the reason why this exists. And what's really critical here is that when you start to really look at populations broken down, you see a quite different story. When you start to disaggregate Asian API communities, you see extensive differences in wealth. And what we always see is just Asian, right? In LA, I think the population with the lowest wealth level was Koreans, around 35,000, and the highest were Japanese at somewhere around 650,000. This is a group that was interned. But the complexity of understanding migration patterns in LA are so challenging, they're very unique. So when we look at who has the top wealth in LA, it is Japanese, Chinese, and South Asian populations. Populations that some don't even have high home ownership rates. So very distinct. And then you turn around and you come to a place like Miami and you start to disaggregate the Cuban population. You see something also very interesting. You see that not as high as wealth as you would think, but you also see differences by Latinx populations, even in LA. So I just want to say that wealth is so particular, right? It's so nuanced. It's something that it's hard to say, what does wealth look like in Seattle? We don't know. No one's ever really done a study to know. Any numbers you've ever seen are iffy, because you've got to go to this level. So I just want to make that clear that every group has a story. It doesn't matter who you are. I grew up in Milwaukee. We had a huge Polish and German population. There are stories there about wealth. There are stories for every group. When we disaggregate even the black population, we know that Africans and Caribbean blacks tend to have more wealth than US descendants. We know that Mexican Americans and US descendant blacks tend to have similar wealth levels, but they differ far more than other Central and South American households. So I know this is a lot, but I just want to say that wealth is tricky. It's hard to really make a general statement. Even when we look at whites across cities, they look very different. So I just want to make that very clear that that's really important, that every racial and ethnic group has its own story, and that story should be told. Today, I'm going to speak a lot in a black and white binary for a couple of reasons. One is because those dynamics have shaped our economy so distinctly. Secondly, it's because there's the best data. The best data is binary data. We just don't have good data on other populations, particularly Asian populations and indigenous populations. So anyway, you're going to hear me speak in a black and white binary tonight, and that's where a lot of the data lies. But we also know this: U.S. black descendants of slaves have some of the lowest wealth levels in this country. We do know that much, so it tells us a lot. Okay, here we go. All right, this is another thing we know. Proximity to blackness, it matters. It matters. I see some of these things are black now. It matters. What we found basically is, like when you go to Miami and you start to look at white Cubans and black Cubans, you see something very different in terms of wealth and other economic indicators, right? When we look at groups that have, that are black Latinx, Dominicans, and Puerto Ricans, we see that their wealth levels very much are similar. So this is, you can see some of these in Boston. Really low, 0, debt, when you look at Puerto Ricans. So everything that we've been able to know about not just wealth, but other economic indicators tells us phenotype matters too. Skin color matters in terms of economic outcomes. And so that's a key factor when thinking about wealth in this country, is that proximity to blackness actually really matters. All right, so here we're going to get into some deeper stuff, right? I think the one thing that we have to think about and why wealth differences exist the way they do is we do have to go back and think about slavery. And so we've got to think about anti-blackness as a foundational architecture of our economy. When we talk about slavery often, we talk about like these plantations and some people were on them and they were small and kind of like, people were riding on horses and telling people to pick cotton. It's almost mythical. But this is a very, very organized system. Our modern economy was built off of techniques from chattel slavery. Depreciation, startup costs, bonds, vertical integration. Those concepts came from slavery. And the ability to actually extract labor and to be very, very clear about how to do it was done during this time. Surveillance was detailed, right? It was not random. There was a clear sense of how much could be made. This is the way capitalism started. This is the way that our economy started, our global economy. This is what made us rich as Americans, right? So we have to think about what happened at that time, right? So when we think about history of what's happened, some of you kind of illustrated this with your responses about your own story, is that largely white Americans have been given this, we describe it as an up escalator, in which they can reach their goals. And black Americans have been forced onto down escalators running up. And we had a paper called Running Up the Down Escalator, because that's really what it is. It's like, really being asked to do more, but the systems and structures in place have limited their ability to build wealth. So let's talk about how that's happened. All right, I know this seems super boring with this chart. It's not to really read all these little words. It's to say this. Over history, from our beginning of our country to 2000 to now, there have been a series of policies. All these on the bottom were blocks, and they represent all different populations. Indigenous folks, Latinx folks, black folks, Hawaiians, all of those. And at the top, these are all boosts. These are all the policies that boosted people to build wealth. In the blue are whites, And then there's a couple of dots for other populations. See that their dots are like a period of time. What's significant about this is all the things that kept people from building wealth over time, and all the things that help people build wealth over time. It's a flip. So it's important to understand that whole trajectory, right? Because it's decades in the making. Let's start with the Homestead Act. Just a little bit of history. We're going to go through just a few policies because we got to like get the foundation of this. Because there are many. You saw them on that chart. So I'm not going through all of those. But think about the Homestead Act. Think about our country, because this is what our country did. Our country said we can create wealth for people. You know, in and of itself, it's wonderful. It just would have been great if all people had access to it. And it didn't actually cause you to actually steal land from other people to get there, right? Right, if you think about the land mass of California and Texas, it wasn't just those states, but the land mass of those two states, 270 million acres, that was given to folks for a $10 fathom free. Basically, right? $10, you could actually come from, you can come from Europe and get access to these lands, right? And so we can trace that about 25% of people still in this country have a lineage connected to the Homestead Act. So think about that, 1868 to 90, just land giveaway. Right? So that was one way. That was like the beginning of one of the beginnings of building wealth in this country. All right. American housing market was used to create wealth for white people. Period. You know, and it maintained white supremacy. Now there are a whole lot of acts the FHA administered to do this over time. But think about it. Between 1934 and 63, $120 billion of home loans were backed, and 98% of those funds went to white households exclusively. So this was a way for people to move from renting to home ownership. In the meantime, you know, when you think about the Great Migration and black people moving north, they were actually moved into really dilapidated housing, and they were paying more in rent. Rent was going up 40%. It was like it is today. They were facing these crazy rent increases in really, really shabby housing. Meanwhile, white people were getting access to homes where they actually paid less than they paid in rent. The flip was happening. So this was so foundational. Even to my own family story of why they could not build wealth through home ownership. So that's one big thing. The Social Security Act is another one. It's big because it excluded people from Social Security. Domestic workers and agricultural workers. My great-grandmother was a domestic. And think about, that was pretty the main job of black people, right? They were domestics. And Latinos were working the land. They were both excluded. They lost about $143 billion in benefits alone. So the real thing about thinking about these policies is think about the investment over generations, right? From the Homestead Act, it's $143 billion. That's just in benefits. Think about these one policy after another policy after another policy. So that was a big one. The GI Bill, which was just mentioned, was the other. It was like, this is our America's greatest path to middle class life, was through the GI Bill. And it did help a lot of working class men go from, you know, from factory to accounting to engineers. People were able to go to college. They were able to start businesses. And this really propelled our nation to what it is today when we think about the middle class. So it really helped white soldiers coming back. What it didn't do is help black soldiers. They were excluded from most of all of it. But it was open. It was saying, here they are. But they couldn't get access to them. Their job training was like as janitors, right? They could only go to black colleges. Those colleges were overrun. They couldn't even take many of those men in. They were facing extreme violence right? People were killing black soldiers that were coming back, and they didn't get access to home ownership. So anyway, that was a little history lesson at almost 6 o'clock. I know it's like, I hope it wasn't super boring. I know it's hard. But if we don't understand that history, we just don't understand why we're in the position we are today. And this history is why, because it really goes back generations and generations. So let me kind of skip ahead a little bit. I'm not going to go through all this right now. I'm going to just end this by giving you a little bit of data, because I'm concerned about people being able to stay awake. So I want to just just give you a few more facts, okay? You know, the thing about what I learned when I started this work is I had so many assumptions about what certain aspects of an asset would do. And one was education. So I always told education is the key. And I'm not saying it's not. In many cases, it is the key to mobility. But what it's not is an equalizer. What it's not is an equalizer. So what this chart is saying is basically white people who have not finished high school have more wealth than a black person who went to college. That doesn't seem logical. Like, that is not how we think as Americans, right? Like, there should be parity here, right? There should be greater, so actually as education goes up, you would think that this gap would get smaller. Like, that intuitively would make sense. But actually the opposite kind of happens. So when you get out to these degrees, out here, and if I broke that out to just professional, that's masters and professionals, there's $1 million difference in wealth. It's the highest gap of all education levels, the top. And so I just say, why is that? Why is it when you have an MD, you're a lawyer, or a PhD, you have more wealth? The wealth difference gets bigger. Why do you think that is?
Is it because more people of color go into like public health and lower paying jobs, or is it also the other social issues like intergenerational wealth and medical families that already had wealth?
Yes, it's the second one.
Okay.
Right? It's not about income here. I always call it the wealth underneath. So what wealth are you coming with when you get a PhD? What wealth are you coming with when you become a doctor and MD? It's that wealth underneath. And yes, someone could be getting their doctorate, but first generation, or maybe not, but they just don't have that wealth behind them. And so as you see people get more education, you'll see that wealth difference. But you'll also see that there is no, what we think is middle class here doesn't look the same for white people and black people. It looks very different across education. That was the first thing that really surprised me when I started this work, and how that difference has gotten even wider. I'm not going to go through that right now. I'm just going to talk about education and income, because a lot of times we conflate wealth and income, right? And think about if you make a lot of money, you're going to have more wealth. And unless you can convert that income into an asset, you're not going to have more wealth. So this is the other thing, right? This is the middle class right here, 3, right? So you see this very difference around people by income, how much wealth they have. Middle class income, very little wealth, right? You know, people at the lowest income level have more wealth, white people, than black people that are middle class, right? So wealth just kind of flips the script on our thinking about a meritocracy, our thinking about the payoff to hard work and education. One of the reasons that we see what we see here is a lot driven by our narratives around hard work, grit, and determination, right? when we think about wealth, we think about a narrative around bootstraps, which is an absurd narrative. It was supposed to be a joke. Now it's become an American ethos, right? To say you can do this on your own. Just work hard, get a good job, and all these things will happen for you, right? And that just is not the case when it comes to wealth. It is not about hard work. It's not about individual achievement. It's not about having education. It is not about those things, right? And so when we continue to say, if we could just teach people how to budget, they're going to get there. And that knows, if I hear financial literacy will send me to a tailspin. Cannot stand it. Do we all need a financial advisor? Yes, right? It's about that we need to fix people so that they can do this. And this is not about fixing people, it's not about behavior change. People say, what's about savings? I have to tell them, black people and white people save at the same rate. There's no difference in saving rates, and in fact, higher income blacks save at higher rates. Right? It's not about saving, it's not about education, it's not about a good job. It's not about those things. It's about all those policies I named, the ways in which people can be kept in place because there are all these other things that have blocked them over time. I wrote a story about my cousin, James, who at 14 was like a mathematical genius. His father worked for a white family, and they're like, hey, that little kid's a genius. Hey, let me get him to college and have him work at my company. Don't go into the military. It was World War I, and good idea. He would have been one of the first blacks to get in to the Naval Academy. Come work for me. And he did. He had 8 patents. He invented alloy, a part of stainless steel. He lived in a black neighborhood. His kids went to black schools. He led an all-black science team. He was amazing in today's terms. His wife went to college. It's not one, no wealth was built. So it wasn't about his effort, his genius, his willingness, his community work, his all of that, his contribution to the country during World War II. Wasn't that? And so we have to move away from this idea that this is individual effort and have to say that wealth is in the roots of our trees. We can't see it, but they're there. And sometimes people say, well, I'm not wealthy. I'm talking about the ability for policies to enable people to have a certain level of privilege, whether that's being able to buy businesses, to live in certain neighborhoods that can accrue value. That's the advantage that propels people. When we think about, for example, millennials got such a bad rap. The avocado toast, all of that, right? But the reality is that that's a group struggling to keep pace with their parents. And it's quite interesting, during the pandemic, white, college-educated married couples did pretty well. They're able to actually amass more assets. They're still behind their parents, about 5% behind. Black millennials are 52% behind their parents, right? And it's not about education, it's about the fact that there's no wealth there underneath. So, what we need to do around this issue is, one, figure out, really understand how wealth is accumulated. Because it was accumulated through government policy. Doesn't mean people didn't work hard, we know that. But what paved the way for them? What policies paved the way for them? What opportunities paved the way for them? We need to shift away from thinking about this as an individual issue. We need to understand the legacy of this country when it comes to wealth. So this is like a primer. I cut out half the slides. Aren't you all happy? I cut out half the slides. But, it's really for us to be really thinking about why we're seeing what we're seeing. you know, being even in this spot and remembering when this area didn't have any, these homes didn't have any value because of who lived here. They didn't have any value. Why don't homes in the majority Black neighborhoods don't accrue equity? Why don't they? Because they're Black. They're depreciated, right? So think about this. A study by Andre Perry of Brookings Institute that really look at this depreciation. You know, it's like $48 billion a year depreciation. Think about all these ways wealth could have been in neighborhoods that weren't. So anyway, I'm going to stop there and let you all get some water or kind of wake up, move your bodies a little bit, and we can have more of a discussion about this and other questions. I did not present all of this information. Actually, some of my information is missing. It's really interesting. Anyway.
Can you leave it on the boost and
Yes. For women and people of color, and they're talking about specifically around tech jobs, have exacerbated the issue even further. It's great. I will send it out post kind of after this as a follow-up. But what I thought was so interesting about that article, because it wasn't actually a surprise. It's something like I think you might hear, like I grew up in Seattle, and I will hear groans about the tech workers from people I grew up with, because you know it feels like the city I grew up with is you know, that was a very like middle-class city, isn't anymore. But what was so interesting about that article was that it actually talked about how the solution is policy change. And they were specifically talking about some pay equity at the federal level. But so my question to you is, I think this slide is amazing, and my question is, like, what are some ideas about where it goes next? Like, what does the boost look like if we start to if we include people of color and indigenous people and Latinx people and Asian people? Like, what are those policy boosts we need at the federal, the state, or the local level?
Well, I think certainly what we saw with the pandemic, I think that certainly, I mean, another census data just came out and certainly showed that we were able to really reduce poverty during that time. It shows that we can get it done if we want to, if we have the will to. You know, when we think about something as simple as, this is some work that we work with the University of Washington, and I know that they have an index here, but when we start to look at childcare, which it's just become so outrageous, that we found basically like people can't afford to, I mean, surprise, surprise, can't afford to have one child, right? Can't afford to have one child. And so childcare costs were outpacing our ridiculous housing costs. So it's just really telling us that when the government put money in people's hands, that we were able to actually begin to solve for poverty, a tax credit, that these were actually things that were working, and poof, they're gone, right? With not much talk about how we're gonna actually do this. Are we gonna commit to doing this? So I would say that would be something that would be a dot, think about it, a dot on that map. But when you think about the policies, look how long it's been since we've had. You know, we have the dot of the COVID stimulus, one dot in 2021. Look how long it's been since we've had a true investment in all American. Well, we've never had an all Americans, but when we did have these types of investments, we're talking, you know, 60 plus years. So we need a big federal investment. That's when the change is going to come. The question is, will we ever have the political will to do it?
Right.
Yeah.
And maybe my follow-up question, and now I'm doing audience questions. I'm going to, because I can't totally read the handwriting, I'm going to see the words and interpret the kind of the essence of this, which is, I think one of the things that when we talk about federal policy, one of the terms that comes up a lot is reparations. And is it reparations? And so what does that look like? And you know, how would that actually, like what does reparations mean to you? Is it at the federal level? And what is it? Like what would that actually mean in policy terms?
Yeah, I think there's a few things there. I mean, when you think about, like I said, think about adding up the cost of some of the policies I named. I named 3 policies, right? Didn't put on there that when you think about land that was taken from black folks through a whole lot of schemes and means, it's $326 billion of lost value of land. $326 billion because land was taken a lot of times by force. So I think what reparations can help us do is a little bit of what I tried to show. We as Americans don't understand this wealth story of our nation. We don't even think about our own wealth story. That's why I'm like, start with self, right? So I think reparations gives us a chance to be able to begin to look at our history. We do need a way of healing, and I think about reparations as an aspect of that. People go right to a payment. I think about it as a process. And so, but there is a dollar value that people are still figuring out that is beyond our comprehension. I mean, that's what's been extracted from people, and obviously not just black people. But to wrap our minds around what that is should let us know that we need some type of payment, right? So reparations has a lot of pieces for me. It's part of its education, part of its healing, and kind of, you know, thinking about our communities. And then the other is, yes, does there need to be a payment? Sure. But when I think about all the extractive measures that are in place that continue to take and take and take, even that won't be enough, right? We need better policies in the end. We need both of those things.
Yeah, that's kind of leading into the next question. The question is specifically about, like, what do you think about baby bonds? And if you're familiar, maybe you could explain that to the audience. But one of the things that I was thinking about when I read that question in relation to your answer is, are policy solutions that kind of, do we actually need to change our economic model in order to have real wealth equality? Meaning, in one hand, baby bonds, you could look at it as a way of growing intergenerational wealth, and on the other hand, it presumes we're still in the same economy. We still have the same economic model. And is that actually what needs to change?
Yeah, in the end, yes. You pose a very, very big question. Certainly. So baby bonds is this idea. This was tried in the UK and quickly abandoned. But it was to really seed families with money, the birth of their child, and when that child becomes an adult, they have access. It's like a trust. It's a trust fund that starts at birth that the government invests in and parents can invest in. And over time, that money grows and then they'll have access to an asset. It's never been fully realized because it's never been done over that time. But the idea of having a young adult trust, a kind of social insurance for a generation, I think would be huge. It's been modeled, it's been shown to address the issue of inequality if we think about it as a universal program where everyone gets something based on your wealth position, right? And so those with the lowest wealth, regardless of who you are, would get the most in the trust. That trust can be invested. So with the same economic model, would that still pose, could there be still inequality? Will there be? Certainly. We need new models that are not so attractive so that people can actually realize these assets and pass them down.
That's great. My next question is, I was going to ask, like, so, you know, why can't we get the political will to pass this? But I want to frame it because I think I answered that in my own head. It's so much, when you...
I hope so.
So what is needed to change that will? Is maybe, you know, thinking about, and the question is specifically around, like, looking at, you know, we're sitting in Seattle, we're in King County, we are in, we're, you know, interesting enough in a very progressive state that has an extremely progressive tax system. Like, what can, you know, what can a group of people like this do to actually change that political will?
Well, Washington State tends to have much more progressive policies, tends to be a leader on so many issues when you think about economic well-being, and I don't think, they will continue to see that. I think it's, some of this is just it's really about deservedness, right? It's really about who we think is deserving of investing in. And we still hold these narratives. We want to say, oh, only certain political ideology, they hold a certain narrative and people over here hold a different narrative. No, we don't. It's the same narrative that we all hold. And, this is something that's not innocent. It's not something that's just by accident. There's an investment in those narratives to say, look, those folks just need to work hard. They need to go to school. They need to stop having children. They need to work hard. They need to do something, right? And I think we should know they should get access to that. They need to be monitored. They need to be tracked. We need to know they're doing the right thing. So they shouldn't get this benefit. That's how we operate. That's how we always operated. And we can't assign that to a political party. We've done some of this research. That is an American belief around deservedness. And we can't change policy if people believe that someone's not deserving of getting help. This is very coded language that now is just, I say this all the time, you just need to use a word and people know what you're talking about. Politically, it's weaponized. Those scoundrels, we need to stop the scoundrels, those cheats. Who are those people? You don't need to say anything more. And we know, we have imagery, we have an idea of what that means. That activates people. That activates people. And they're absolutely right. They don't need to get this. We know there's all these universal basic income GI pilots, and even people piloting, there's like tons of them. We have like 30 in California. And they're like, what we need to do is we need to make them fill out all this information that's really, people getting this as part of a pilot to make sure they're going to do the right thing. Are we giving people cash? Are we not giving them? Are we going to give them cash or not give them cash? Do we trust people? No. The answer is no. Right? So until these narratives shift, until we believe that people are deserving, say what you will, people were happy about cash they received during the pandemic, but after I've been talking to some folks we're working with, they're like, people just didn't want to work. They were lazy. Like, what this did was really make people lazy. We hear that narrative, that lazy narrative is like, we love to talk about how lazy people are. We love it. Now, granted, in America, in this country, we work about 300 hours more than the French, right? We're working too much. We're like, gosh, and those people are so lazy. They don't want to work. We talk about this because our focus is on Black women and this idea of them, and they have worked, and they've had higher labor participation rates than any other group over history. They were always working, but yet, Ronald Reagan and his welfare queen piece, that was huge. We still have that thinking, right? We saw the imagery, right? That the fact of the imagery is so important. And so until we actually do work on that, like policy just doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Right.
You have to believe that this group is worthwhile. Some groups veterans are worthwhile. We believe in our veterans. We believe a fair amount in our elders, not enough. But they're deserving, right? So that just does not exist for a lot of populations. It doesn't exist for a lot of parents. So that's what's really important for us to shift.
Have you seen, maybe just as a follow-up, have you seen any shift since you've been doing this work in the narrative change, or has it been pretty stagnant? like what's worked to change the narrative? I'm so I get that, we need narrative change, and have there been examples of that working? Smaller scale.
On the biggest scale, it's marriage equality. On the biggest scale, right? You know, and notice when that campaign started, it was called gay marriage, right? And then what happened, people are like, gay marriage, that's a different kind of marriage. That's not a real, that's a certain other kind of marriage, right? And people found their narrative work that when they said gay marriage, people thought, this is not a true marriage, this is a different marriage. So some of their language changed. Certainly they had a strategy about characters on television programs. It was a cultural narrative shift, right? Now what we're seeing is a complete backlash, right? But that was an example of a successful, over about 8 years, narrative change. These are deeply ingrained ideas that we have as Americans. It just is what it is. Like, it's like it's like we're not even conscious of it because it's just playing all the time in various ways. And so and people hold competing beliefs. We found this, you know what? I just want to support mothers as they go to work. We've got to support all these mothers and they need help as they go back to work. But some women don't want to work. Right? We can hold one belief and another belief. And so to move policy, we've got to get that side, we want to all swing this way, right? So understand how people think, not what we want them to think, but how they actually think. And that way we can start to see some change. But it takes time, that's all I'm saying. This is an over the horizon work.
Yeah.
Generations.
No, I agree. I mean, I didn't raise my hand when you asked the question about like your story of wealth, but I thought about it because I am Japanese American, 4th generation. My great-grandparents immigrated here, and my grandfather was actually born down the street. He went to Garfield, which is stone's throw away, and he didn't graduate because he was incarcerated. He was put in the internment camps. But what was and at that time they took all his property. His parents had a small business, they took the house. But when he was released from the internment camp, he joined the military. And he very much embraced that narrative. And he is, I think, and that was we were very much raised under that bootstraps and very to act white. And it's been interesting to see just in my generation having that change, and it's complicated. It's super complicated. I feel really conflicted about, that he was the kindest man I knew, and that man loved Ronald Reagan. And we may have not given him his ballot during the Trump election. He couldn't vote. He was not in this. But it was like he held that, and this is the same person that didn't graduate high school because he's the government intern, and that could not buy a home on Capitol Hill because he was Japanese American and he was redlined out of there. And it's just it's fascinating that we hold those, and he was like the kindest person you've ever met. It's a lot of work because it is conflicting. I think I forget that how much of my own identity is tied to that. I'm going to step back, and this is a great kind of intro question that someone asked, but just when you're talking about definitions, like when you look at those slides, how do they define wealth? Like how is wealth actually defined economically? I think income is something I understand. You fill out your tax returns, but wealth is, I think the only time, and I didn't have to, that I have never had to tell anybody well, so what does that mean in an academic sense? Like, how are we capturing that? And I know you said it's hard.
Well, if you think about every asset you own, everything you own, minus everything that you owe, that's your wealth, right? That's your wealth position, right? So, when you have, people with more wealth have more of a portfolio, right? We want to talk about people, just get a home ownership. And, it is an asset, but it can be an asset that can work for you or not. It's still a risk, right? I think about one of my relatives, his mother bought a house, bought it and passed it on. She bought it for $70,000. Where'd she buy that house? the Castro in San Francisco, right? So meanwhile, this one modest woman who was a working class woman was able to pass down something that they could sell for about $2 million, right? So it's, I was born in Dayton. Our house was purchased by my parents for $10,000, 1961. Today, it's probably worth $12,000, $15,000. I don't know who would actually move in that neighborhood now. It's not worth anything, and it never was worth more than that, right? So it's not just about one asset, it's having multiple types of assets, having a portfolio that you have retirement accounts, you have some stocks, you have some savings, you have an asset like a home that can accrue value, like all those things help you have a nest egg, right? So oftentimes we want to save for low income, but get an asset. And yes, I'm not saying that's not important, but then you think, well, what is that asset? And is that an asset that can be passed down? Because that house was not, our cousins up the street were like, we just look bad now. Like, we don't even want to deal with it. It's not even worth it, right? Like, it is not an asset that can be passed down, right? And sometimes people, lose that asset. I was told by someone working here, like 40% of Black folks that were homeless were homeowners. Like, it's mind-boggling. But, so the thing is, that's what wealth is. It's just everything that you own and minus everything you own. And for our study, people were willing to tell us those things, which is quite amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing. I'm going to ask more of a niche question for the audience, which is our profit-driven healthcare system designed to maintain, if whoever asked that question could help finish that?
Oh, of course I asked that question. Privilege versus disadvantage.
Privilege versus, is our profit-driven healthcare system designed to maintain profit and disadvantage? No, was that?
Privilege.
Privilege and disadvantage, sorry. Terry?
Yes. In so many different ways, right? Why are we the only country that really ties work to getting health care? It's emphasis that we have on work as worth, as work as worthiness. And so certainly that's going to make a difference. The way the hospitals are consolidating, the way that, people are not have to travel miles to find health care beyond everything that's happening with Roe. So certainly there are deep inequities that, what we see is medical debt, and groups that tend to have more medical debt. So that certainly keeps you from building wealth. So definitely yes.
Thank you. I'm going to read this question because it's a little long. Ray Cheney talks a lot about income inequality by geography and race, and his group's research has demonstrated, if I'm remembering right, the positive impacts on Black, minority, low-income families that move into middle-class neighborhoods with much better access to resources, and the lasting impacts on their kids' outcomes positive. So is the solution not to reduce solution to reducing income inequality, not only access to good housing, but also resource-rich neighborhoods that are diverse and integrated. Integrated neighborhoods as the solution.
Okay, let me try to tackle this. First of all, Raj Shetty is one of the very, 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 very few people that has access to wealth data, from what I hear. And he doesn't use it. He's talking about income, right? So income is quite different. We've got to think about that. We've got to think of the difference between income and wealth, right? It's not that you can't buy assets and build assets with income, you can. But that is not how your wealth is accumulated, right? So, I think about my own story. My parents were separated. My mom was a teacher. She knew the value of education. She moved us to a suburb with one of the best schools in the state. Did that provide opportunity for me to certainly do well in college and get a graduate degree? certainly. Did it help me necessarily build wealth? Right? Let's think about the difference. What helps you build wealth, right? Having access to resources certainly can open up opportunities. It can enrich your experiences, the kind of experiences that you want your children to have. There's no doubt about it. But there's so much more than thinking about that. And I didn't get into talking about work and how segmented our labor market is, how segregated it is by race. We don't think about it that way, but sometimes think about it. When you're in certain places and you're like, why is everyone here look the same that does this job, right? So, we've got to think about how people get access to that, and it's not just because they moved into a middle class neighborhood. And that might help in build some income, but it's not a wealth builder in and of itself, right? So that's the thing that people get about Raj, because he talks about income inequality. That's one aspect, but wealth is our North Star. Wealth is our North Star. That's the thing that holds us down, right? Income, look what happened in the pandemic. Income was fleeting, right? And what happened when some people couldn't work for several months, right? So that's the difference. Great on income inequality, but he doesn't talk about wealth. That's not his focus, so that's the difference.
Would it be fair to say, and I could be way oversimplifying this, but one of the reasons it's important to think about wealth is that you and I might make the same, we might both be hired to make the same income, say $100,000, but I walk into that, because my parents paid for college, so I don't have, you have, $100,000 in student debt. I don't have anybody else I have to take care of, or you have family members that might depend on you. Additionally, because of certain tax rules, let's say, I am the primary earner, for my partner, I'm taxed at a different rate than you are. Is that why it is so important? We don't actually start at the same place, and we're not going to go to the same places because of policy. Is that kind of is that a simplified way of putting what you just said?
It's a great way of saying it. It's a great way. What's more invisibilized in our tax code? Who benefits from home mortgage deductions? Who thinks about all the exemptions? You think about the 10 federal exemptions that resulted in somewhere like $100 billion of people being able to write things off. You need wealth to do that. You need wealth to benefit from the tax code, right? In the first place. You need access to certain homes with certain levels of value. You need access to employment that has certain types of benefits, right? And you can gift. Your gift is tax-free. The tax code, right? And you can just keep going and going. My gift to giving $300 to my uncle or thousands of dollars, I can't write that off. So think about the difference in what is happening with even giving and how it's differentiated. The penalty of marriage, right? And how this was really built for a one-wage earner. Our tax code was built mainly for white people. That's who was in mind when it was put into law in so many ways. And so, yes, that's kind of invisible. We don't see the benefit of that. We just say, God, she makes a good salary, right? But we don't think about how the tax code enriches folks, right? We don't think about, even something like what you can write off for student loans. Who has student loans? The most, highest student loans, right? You can only write off $2,500. Well, for some people, that's all they owe, right? So there's so many ways that we don't see. It's so hidden, but it's just a multitude of ways in which this happens. But yes, you did. That was a great way of putting it, right?
I've got one more audience question, and I'm going to help from whoever wrote this, because I think if I'm reading the question right, how can intergenerational be explored in places by race and ethnicity? Does anyone want to, I think
That was my question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Brad, would you mind clarifying that question?
Well, you talked a lot about the data that goes by neighborhood, or, you know, you have to really understand it. How do you get the information to tell those stories about it? How do you study that?
Someone has to give you a lot of money. Right? I mean, I think the study that I was involved in, that's been 6 years ago, was $1 million study. The Ford Foundation gave the money. And they're like, we don't want to work on wealth anymore. There's not a lot of philanthropy focused on wealth. What we have are people like Wells Fargo is like home ownership, start a business. But in terms of studying wealth, you know, it's like a study here and there. You know, it's really one thing that we saw with the study that we did is we found that when I was talking about like flipping the script on this, we found that when parents have enough wealth to help their adult children, and this is data, we don't know how much, right? It's not in the data. We found equalized outcomes, which meant when Black parents who do help their children financially when they can, had equal college completion rates with whites that also got help. Far less help. Equal college graduation rates and equal graduate school rates completion, right? Closer home ownership rates, like things were closer, still had more wealth. But the idea that that's really the flip of it. But we need more study. We need to understand the dynamics of wealth, and there's just not a lot of funding for it. So that's part of it. We need a way to do this. I have been putting forward an idea of what if we did an adult trust pilot? Let's see what happens. We can give some young adults some money and let's study and see its impact. No one wants to fund that. No one wants to fund that. No one wants to fund that. They'll give someone $500 a month pilot. They don't want to fund a wealth pilot. Very interesting, right? So that's part of it. We need certain special studies, like we need someone that can come into Seattle and really, it's such a diverse city and really understand what's happening here. We get a lot, you get data to say there's so many millionaires and so forth, but we don't, it takes an investment, and that's been hard to come by, very hard to come by.
Can I just ask a clarification question about that last example you gave? When you said that proposed a study to give youth a lump sum of money, and no one wants to study that, A, why not? And can you say more about what that study would be doing differently from, say, a universal basic income kind of approach?
Yeah, I mean, understand, guaranteed income was something that was proposed in the 70s. It was even tested, right? And there's been some amazing studies. There's been, like, for example, in indigenous communities in the Smokies, they basically had like a permanent GI, and it changed so many things. It changed crime, for example. It changed college going. It reduced stress, so there were health outcomes. Parents that had more time with my children, all these things. So the thing is, we know giving people cash to help them live works, right? Like, it's been piloted. We don't actually need more pilots. People just love the idea of like, look what happens when we can give someone $500 a month. I'm not knocking that. I'm saying that the point of the pilots was to get us to a federal policy. So it's supposed to be pilot to policy. And part of the pilot issue is deservedness. If we just trust people to spend the money in the way that they want, because they know how to take care of their families, people will be better off. But we have to have stories around deservedness, right? That's the narrative work of GI is deservedness and trust.
What was the other thing you were talking about?
The other thing I was saying is, what if we give a young adult, because our proposal was anywhere at the low end of what a baby bonds proposal is like $20,000 to $25,000.
And just see what they do with it?
and see what happens, right? And see how is that going to help. We don't have to wait 18 years, give someone 24, give them the money and see what happens, right? And you can even see what will happen over the short term, like what happens after 5 years, right? At some point, we have to see the generation. Why are we content with having generations do worse than the last generation? Why are we content with that? That is un-American. We are a nation that says we are here. You don't say, you know what, I hope my kid, yeah, they'll do something, I don't know. Like, you know, like you were like, yeah, I want my kid to be better off than I was. Yeah, I want my kids and my grandkids to be comfortable and want them to be able to live out their dreams, right? We don't say, yeah, I hope they can make it. You know, like, we want the next generation to be better. And we already know that they're not. We blame a lot of it, oh, the, you know, technology and TikTok and avocado toast and whiners and whatever, right? But like, let's look at this financially. Like, did some of us in this room have to deal with the kind of debt that young people are facing today? When I hear them say, I'll never own a home, but maybe I'll be okay. They're sitting there with $150,000 in debt, right? And we're okay with it, right? We're okay with that. So the idea of saying, can we just test the model? Because it's different than just giving someone cash and saying, here you go. We know they're gonna, some people will save it, some will spend it on food. But how do we actually help people accrue assets and build wealth? We don't really know because we've never done it. Can we just try it with 50 people?
Yeah.
I said this to, I said it to someone at Rockefeller. They're like, well, I said, why don't we start with people we know are not going to have an asset? Let's start with like either young adults who had a parent who was incarcerated or emancipated foster youth. Let's see, like what would happen? Well, those, you know, we can't get into people who've been engaged in certain systems. And I'm like, but it's not. It's their parent. Never mind. You know, it's like, we can't give it to those people because they're not deserving. That's basically what you were saying, right? And so the idea of the amount of money, I think might be intimidating. Like, what are we going to do? Should it be restricted? That's a test. Should we just let people do whatever, or should we say it should be for these kinds of activities? That's been a debate. So why can't we test it to see? People don't want to do it. They'll give $18 million to a GI pilot.
Did they think that it was because it would be too small of a study, with only 50 people?
Well, I'm like, start somewhere.
Yeah.
I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, can we, like, you know, some of the GI pilots are pretty small. I mean, you know, yes, I'd love it with more people, but like, can you just invest? I asked one very, very, very wealthy person who was running a foundation, can you put like $6 or $7 million into the pilot? And they chose to say, I'd rather build a data platform. Okay, that's what I'm saying, right? Like, there's just some, I think it has to do with deservedness.
I think we have time for 2 questions with people that had their hands raised. I saw one there and then Ruby.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
I'll comment.
Terry, okay, so it's, we've got one there, Shasheen,
Yeah.
and then Terry. So we'll do these final 2 questions from the audience.
Okay, I'm going to try to make this succinct, but the question is about how we talk about deservedness in the culture that we are currently in the Pacific Northwest region. Because my experience here in having very interracial, intercultural families is that there's a lot of shame around wealth, and in certain cultural communities you do not talk about it. And also more recently, like I went to a Kingsley fundraiser where someone was talking about building Black wealth and they were hosting the fundraiser, but that's like a very different way of talking about wealth if you're of like the WASP heritage in the Northwest. And also I'm curious because you referenced 2 East Coast foundations and then you didn't reference the individual donor. But I want to think about how you're going to the East Coast asking for this funding to academia. So I just wonder how, like, I think it's really important that we think about how to, just like, how do you propose we actually talk about wealth here when it's sort of like a taboo subject, I feel like.
Well, if it's not named, it can't be tackled. So we have to start naming it. Like, all this is just the truth. Like, there's some uncomfortable truths, right? And we have to examine it, so it starts there. Do people have individual shame around wealth? Certainly. I mean, who's gonna be like, let me just tell you about my portfolio and all my money. Like, it's not something that we feel comfortable in society. It's taboo. We don't talk about money. But the idea of, I mean, there's wealth in various forms outside of financial, just the money, right? People talk about what health, they talk about their cultural institutions. Those are forms of wealth, right? So there's ways that we can access that conversation that's not like, tell me all about your portfolio. And, you know, I think culturally why, yes, I named authors for all East Coast foundations, but I think the idea is that it's hard to break through on this topic. It's hard to break through on this topic. It's hard to break through with fund. I just said that a major funder stopped funding any work on this work. There's not a lot of foundation money here to do anything with. But we have the rise of individual approaches, the rise of like, just help, can we get these 3 Black businesses, or can 5 families now get a home? That's where we're at. It's very individual, and we have to go to the structural.
And I think we've got one last question.
Yeah, I was going to stand up so I could see. Thank you so much, really fascinating. So I'm most interested in, are you aware of municipalities, government entities, public-funded pilots or policies that you find really interesting that are actually going on across the states that are not beholden to philanthropists who have accumulated wealth who determine what's worthy enough?
Yes. I mean, I'm interested in municipalities that want to tackle this issue. I think it's becoming increasingly hard because you can't talk about race. I mean, there are places we work with that are like, now we can't talk about this. It was Florida, which I'm like, I don't know what you are going to do there. You know, I mean, largely this is a federal issue, but like, where can we start to tackle this at a local level? I think the biggest problem is that we still have this idea, I call it the mac and cheese. The mac and cheese is entrepreneurship, homeownership, and education. And when we talk about like we're going to do wealth and community, it's either financial literacy or those 3 things. So, you know, I would say that we're getting it wrong because we don't really understand what's going to help build wealth and why it's different for every group. They're not positioned the same. So to throw a bunch, like to me, to say BIPOC, it's not in this instance because I just showed you every group comes to this so differently. So we have to be able to understand this issue, diagnose it, and understand what our locus of control is to do something. I'll just close by saying we can stop some extractive practices. Why are we putting people into debt? Why are we putting people into debt that we can't collect? Like, we can actually stop doing that. And so I always say, start with the low-hanging fruit. Can you stop stripping people of resources? That might be a good start, right? So there's things that can be done at all levels of government.
Thank you. Let's all give a hand. And so I just wanted to close out. Thank you again. But to also share, like, you know, if you were thinking what I'm thinking, it's like, okay, so what can we do about this? And this is really, you know, I'm motivated. I want to talk about this. I want to change the narrative. I want to see policy change. I want to see it in the city. I want to see it at the county, at the state. I want to see it at the federal level. And it feels really daunting. It feels like really, really like it's 400 years. And so, you know, that is the space that really SVP wants to provide. Is, you know, when we really looked at like where do we use our voice and this idea of wealth, it touches everything that we care about. You know, I know many of you care about education in here. You care about climate change. You care about equal rights. You care about, you know, housing. Like, but this really, you know, what I'm hearing is this touches everything. And so this was the first in a series where we're really learning, but we're learning, what I'm calling learning into action. We've got 3 more sessions planned, and this is like my call to action to you is come join these, come start to talk to people. We're really interested in moving towards actually supporting policy change. We've got a panel on October 18th where we're going to hear from just like a little piece. And so just the potential there at the state level, what's going on. And then Terry, who's standing there in the back, is going to lead the last session, which is virtual, getting us ready for those of us that are interested in kind of that narrative change and specifically policy change to get ready to act. There are a lot of amazing groups doing this work. You'll hear from a lot of them at the policy considerations panel, and we're interested in supporting them. So to be really clear, SVP, we're not hiring a lobbyist, we're not doing our own, but we're ready to really support those efforts, support the narrative change going on out there. So that's my ask to you. And the postcard, again, you can go to our website, you can sign up for the other event. I also want to say if you want to talk more after this, if you're a member of the Advocacy Task Force, if you could raise your hand. We've got Renee, we've got 5 of them here. Like, they have all offered to have coffee or drinks with you and talk more about this. And so go up to them and get their number because they want to talk to you. So again, a huge thank you. Thank you for joining us from California. And I can't wait to